this afternoon by the name of Dr. Canute Thompson. He is a professor of educational policy, planning, and leadership at the University of the West Indies and project director of the university's Governance, Recommendation, Implementation Committee. He is the author of 8 books, 18 journal articles, and over 200 newspaper columns, in which he discusses a variety of issues on accountability, corruption, development, education, justice, and leadership. Dr. Thompson is a social activist who is active on social media, where he engages in debates and speaks fearlessly to those who hold power. His scholastic achievements include Principals Award of Research, Bronze Prize winner in the 2022 Independent Published Book Awards, and he's a finalist. He was a finalist in the Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence. So this afternoon, I would like to hand you over to Dr. Canute Thompson.
So I was making the point then that leadership sought to reinforce the presumptions and the expectations of the plantation economy, which was educational leadership, that is, and these presumptions and expectations were about preparing people for narrowly defined roles in the economy. Best and Levitt 2009 argue that despite the exposure of many post-independence Caribbean nationals, the vestiges of a colonial mindset in their application of teaching and learning remain part of the education landscape of many educational systems in the Caribbean. And Potter and Hilton Fraser 2022 contend that the strictures of colonialism continue to impact education leadership in the Caribbean. Ex-slaved, they were enslaved, they continue to be enslaved to varying degrees. What is this Caribbean space that we are seeking to reshape? What is this Caribbean space that continues to bear the elements, to reflect the images, to convey the characteristics, as it were, of post-slavery society? So we continue in the main to struggle to attain and sustain economic development, not just growth. And in fact, one of the critiques I have made of much of the economic philosophy of Caribbean societies is the misplaced emphasis on economic growth rather than economic development. And Lloyd Best has long ago made the point that you can have growth without development, right? We, as a region, we are the destination, or the region represents a destination for the exploits of our geographical and cultural giftedness and assets. Many countries of the Caribbean are seen as the desired location for cheap labor when compared to other regions of the world, and we have underexploited natural resources. I'm arguing that the perpetuation of the culture of exploiting cheap labor is an example of the continuation of the slavery, post-slavery framework and philosophy. Another characteristic of this Caribbean society, with its post-slavery elements, lower than desired levels of educational attainment, some of which I'll show momentarily, low levels of tertiary participation, low GDP per capita, differentiated across countries nonetheless, but compared to other regions of the world, low, and high levels of crime and violence. And I suggest that we also have untapped economic potential in sports and culture. Let us take a quick look at what I would regard as some of the social consequences of colonial education. Now, I welcome a debate which would question whether there is a correlation between these outcomes, these social data, and the actual education system. I welcome that debate, and I'm making the case that part of the explanation for the high levels of violence across the countries of the Caribbean, with 5 Caribbean countries in 2017, and the same number 5 in 2019, ranking among the top 10 most violent places on earth per capita. All right. So my homeland, Jamaica, ranks at number 2, or ranked at number 2 in 2017. It is number 4 in 2019 in the global ranking, with 57 and 47 murders per 100,000. Seconded by Belize, as you can see there, followed by the Bahamas, St. Lucia, and then Dominica in 2017. And in 2019, you see the figures. So Jamaica remains number 1, Belize remains number 2, St. Vincent and the Grenadines replaces Bahamas as number 3, St. Kitts and Nevis number 4, and then Trinidad and Tobago number 5. The argument I'm making is that these outcomes are in part, at least, due to the structures and strictures of our colonial education system. And the question that must be answered by us is, what are the key leadership imperatives, leadership philosophies, leadership initiatives that must be undertaken by those of us who are in the sphere of education to address these outcomes? I want to show you a second set of numbers. This table, listed in alphabetical order, shows the level of tertiary participation across the Caribbean, all right? With Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados ranking up at top at 65%. And among the others, we have 3 countries in the 20s, and the others are in the teens. And the question we want to ask ourselves, what does low tertiary participation mean for, among other things, crime and violence, innovation, peace and justice, conflict resolution, GDP per capita, and an overall state of a healthy society? Without taking you through those numbers, I can tell you that in the OECD countries, the level of tertiary participation is on average above 60% across most of these countries, with places like Singapore being 90%, Thailand being 69%, Finland being about 60%. Let me pick up a couple of countries, randomly chosen from across the world, randomly chosen according to the regions, to show you what the picture looks like. So in Africa, we have this country, medium-sized country, Algeria, 44 million population. Their tertiary participation is 52%. Their murder rate is 1.36 per 100,000. And a global innovation index, the level at which they're generating the level of their innovative capacity and output, patents and so on, 23.9, with a GDP per capita of 11,000 United States dollars. Compared to Barbados, population of less than 300,000, GDP of 5.2 billion, GDP per capita in about 20,000, tertiary participation 65%, and murder rate less than 10 per 100,000. Global Innovation Index 42.5. China, GDP of 14 trillion. GDP per capita, 11,000. Tertiary participation, 1 in 2. Murder rate, less than 1 per 100,000. And Global Innovation Index, 53. Let's skip down to Europe, Denmark. Population 5.8, GDP 350 billion, tertiary participation 80%, GDP per capita 58,000, murder rate 1 per 100,000, innovation index 57. Jamaica, just about 3 million, GDP 16 billion, per capita 6,000, tertiary participation 27, murder rate, as we said, 47, and global innovation index 29. New Zealand, I mentioned, 83% tertiary participation in a population of 5 million. GDP per capita, 42,000, less than 1 per 100,000 murders, and global innovation index 47. And then Singapore, almost every child who leaves school goes on to participate in tertiary education at 97%. Murder rate less than a quarter per 100,000. I'm suggesting that what this tells us, without positing causation, we can assert that there's a clear relationship between education, tertiary participation, and other indices such as productivity, social health, and innovation. So I'm saying then that part of the calling that leaders in the Caribbean must answer, part of the call, is how we undertake to spur policy consciousness. We excuse Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago to some degree from this, from the urgency and the burden, but nonetheless, 65, though good compared to others, should look to move to 95. So that's my case, that leadership is going to be critical to change the shape of our experience in terms of our productivity and ultimately our quality of life as a society. Post-colonial society wasn't concerned about the quality of life of citizens broadly. It was concerned with their compliance with the expectations of the society, and their capacity to contribute to the wealth that was being extracted and expropriated in developing the cities of London, Bonn, and other first world countries, which now must answer the call about reparations. And I am of the view that reparatory justice must be focused on how the development years that have been lost, the development resources that have been unjustly taken, should be now repatriated to support development. And that is one of the areas of educational leadership. I won't spend time on this. I was just doing a comparison with tertiary participation and the top 3 innovation performers in different regions of the world. But my time will be taken too quickly if I spend time on this. We could always come back to this as part of a discussion. But the pattern continues in terms of the higher the levels of participation, the higher the levels of innovation. All right, so I want to turn now very quickly to defining the purpose of education and the role of leadership. So we're asking the question then, if the post-colonial education system was tapered and textured in a way to ensure that the mass of the population became products for an economic system based on exploitation, to what extent was there real deviation from what one might argue or one might say are the real purposes of education? And again, mindful that I have 20 minutes or so, I just want to highlight these thinkers across the span of the last 500 years. Comenius, John Amos Comenius, in the 16th century, posits that education should be about lifelong learning, focusing on logical thinking, problem solving, and education providing a practical expression of the competences and interests of the learner, right? The educational experience must facilitate the expression of the interests and capacity of the learner. And it must be a continuous lifelong experience. Dewey, all the way into the 20th century, suggests that, sorry, some battery problems, education should really be about intellectual development towards the goal of facilitating and enabling critical thinking and promoting cultural awareness. And ultimately, learning must be a product of experience. Illich, with whom many of you are familiar, one of the radical thinkers of the last 50 years, Ivan Illich, argues that development of capacity for self-direction and self-governance are the key elements of a decolonized education system. His famous book, his classic Deschooling Society, speaks to precisely the problems he saw, that the education system had created an obstruction in the mindset and in the capacity and confidence of learners. And therefore, liberation, decolonization would come as we purged society from the defects of schooling. His colleague, contemporary, Franz Fanon, makes a similar point. Noding, Black American feminist scholar, Nell Noding, says that education is really about producing caring and competent people. Caring in terms of the quality of their relationships, their capacity to be human and to express humanness and humanity towards others, but also being competent in a range of skills that are necessary for human flourishing. And that's a key word she uses, flourishing. Colonial education, post-colonial education was not about supporting and advancing the flourishing of the human being, right? And the Latin American scholar Dussel talks about liberation as the ultimate objective of education, challenging the colonial mindset, which was exploitation and control. In my own work, I talk about the critical elements of critical thinking, adaptive learning. Adaptive learning is my emphasized notion that human beings have the capacity and have the duty to adapt themselves to the challenges of their environment and to find solutions for meaningful and enriching survival and growth in those challenging environments. So one of the points I make is that given the kind of characteristics of our Caribbean society, problem of global warming, the problem of low take-up of educational opportunities, the problem of an insufficiently articulated policy relationship between budgetary priorities and long-term development, part of our task is now to understand that that is a landscape and to begin to challenge thinking around how that changes. One of the things that politicians tend to say, not all of them, but many, that we can't do better. We can't do better. And leadership must challenge that notion that our priorities are functions of our philosophies. And we can do differently and can do better without change in our philosophies. I suggest another role of leadership really is about embracing new epistemologies and new understanding. I side with Miller, 2013, who advocates that the need for school leaders to be continuously interrogating how they lead and how they work. I also side with Hitton and Betters, who call for an interrogation of program development. We tend to just use the thing that we inherit. There needs to be an activist work in the area of social justice. We need to challenge the systems. That is the fundamental role of leadership. Questioning relentlessly what we inherit and what we're doing. How much more time do I have, Madam Chair? I want to move quickly to talk about some features of decolonized education, and just to mention. So, mastery of context, I mentioned that. The ability to solve problems, to manage conflicts, and to create alternatives. Why is managing conflicts so central to education in my thinking? Look at the murder rate per capita across the Caribbean. That is one of our greatest challenges. And education, or might I say a philosophy of education and educational leadership, must be responding to the greatest challenges facing society. So adaptation, which is one of the constructs I promote, is not acceptance of what is, but recognizing that what is contrary to what our ideals are, and therefore to adapt our thinking, adjust our philosophies, reallocate our resources so we can deal with those issues. And I call then for alternative thinking. The notion that the way it is how it can be, and there are no alternatives to what is a self-defeating disposition. I also talk about another feature and pardon the incorrect heading. It's features of decolonized education, the slide should say. Respecting others and feeling respected in return. I suggest that it is that question of respect for otherness and the embrace of the value of compassion as a way of being that explains is one of the explanations, might I say, for the high levels of conflict in Caribbean societies. And finally, the issue of well-being. Our work as education leaders should promote what Nodding calls human flourishing, human well-being. Finland, for 6 consecutive years, has been voted the happiest place on earth. And one of the variables, one of the factors in the happiness index is people feeling that someone cares for them. It's an amazing piece of simple humanity. The idea that you are not alone. And I'm saying that in a profoundly critical way. One of the issues that our leadership emphasis must address is creating a sense of belonging in society. Pardon me? We have some realities that we must deal with as we try to make the thrust towards these ideals of decolonized education. We have the pre-existing learning crisis made worse by COVID-19 and the learning losses and the isolation and exclusion. We have paid inadequate attention to early childhood education. We have a shortage of a shortage of high quality teachers, and we have the propensity to ignore evidence and data in making policy. This is an area in which education leaders must play a critical role, hammering home the point that you don't make policy based on a one-off conversation you have with however influential a person is. You don't make policy based on a protest, a single protest. You look for the evidence, and if there's one weakness in Caribbean society, it is its failure to make evidence the basis of policy. I end now by talking to some what I would call some critical elements. I touch on some what I would call some issues of the main vein of decolonized education. When I spoke about mastery of context and conflict management and so on, I want to talk to some practical issues now which constitute the critical elements of decolonized education. So from where I sit and look at much of the research that's there are some key issues. There's some key things. Firstly, innovation. We spoke throughout this presentation about the importance of innovation, and we see the correlation between innovation and tertiary participation. But we notice that among many Caribbean countries, our innovation index is low. Part of the reason innovation was, or might I call, disinnovation is a feature of post-colonial society, is that we were not trained to problem solve. We're trained to fit in, to follow instruction, to be obedient, and to take instruction. All right? None of those behaviors, none of those expectations require innovation. So part of where the lever of the future rests is how we now make innovation a way of life. And for innovation to become a way of life, we'll have to abandon the prescriptive curriculum and replace it with the constructive or constructivist curriculum. But there's a critical issue of educational justice and peacemaking. I'm saying that our societies are scarred not only by the painful realities of our history when we were treated as animals or for parents, but we among ourselves have high levels of conflict. And education must, the issue of educational justice, which includes reparations and the reacculturation of our societies, also involves peacemaking. I see you coming on, Madam Chair, so no, my time is going. Knowledge export, reshaping curriculum, refashioning tertiary education. And then I look at where some of the key areas of future service demand is. And I'm saying, unless our education system is moving towards equipping our graduates to become competent in these areas, we're going to be left behind. And I close off by listing some courses that I believe would advance educational justice, which are relevant to our society. But I want to yield to your appearance on the screen, Madam Chair.